right, we seem to have a decent crowd here now. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that McMaster University, the host institution for the Canadian Research Data Center Network, is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Welcome Agreement. We'll begin this session by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations and recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. You can visit Native Land Digital, a space where non-Indigenous people can learn more about the lands they inhabit, the history of those lands, and how to actively be part of a better future going forward together. It gives me great joy to welcome France-Pascale Ménard and Claude Girard to speak to us today about the new census gender questions. France-Pascale is an analyst with Statistics Canada. Claude Girard is a senior methodologist. And they're going to team up to give this presentation, from which we'll learn a lot. I have been asked to remind everyone and remind myself that the gender variables are not yet available in the RDC. There's no fixed time or expected date, but they will be coming. There's just some lingering issues related to vetting and confidentiality because this is such a vulnerable and small population. So without further ado, I will turn it over to France-Pascale, who will get us started. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so save your questions. And of course, it's a meeting. So at that time, you can turn your camera on, unmute yourself, and ask your questions. While France-Pascale and Claude are speaking, I will ask people to keep their cameras off and themselves muted. Thank you.
Thank you. I will start with sharing my screen. All good?
Yep, looks fine.
Okay, so hi everybody. My name is France-Pascale Ménard. I use the pronouns she, her. I'm an analyst in the Center for Demography, and I was the lead analyst for the census release on gender diversity for the 2021 census. So I will start my presentation with some background information, and then I'll summarize the sex at birth and gender standards and our gender dissemination strategy. Then I'll summarize the main results from the 2021 census on gender diversity and gender diversity of couples. And then I'll give you a brief overview of the changes related to gender we're suggesting making to the next census. And also I'll talk about some exploratory work, and then Claude will take over. And just so you know, you can ask your questions in either English or French. So around the 2016 census, StatCan started receiving comments on the sex question. It was judged too exclusive since it provided only two response options, male and female. So some respondents indicated that they were not able to see themselves in these options. Around the same time, the legislative environment in Canada experienced some major changes related to gender. For instance, Bill C-16 was adopted in 2017, formally recognizing the protection for gender expression and gender identity under the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code of Canada. So it's around that time that StatCan started investigating ways to measure the transgender and non-binary populations through its various statistical vehicles, including the census. So one of the first steps was to engage with experts in the field of gender identity. We did a lot of consultations, qualitative testing that included focus groups and one-on-one interviews, including with people with lived experience. And so all this was led to the development of the questions and the standards. And by standards, I mean the definitions and classifications that we use to disseminate the information. So the new sex at birth and gender variables and classifications were released in 2018. And the main goal was to be more inclusive and account for gender diversity in Canada, but also to help clarify the two concepts that used to be used interchangeably. These new questions were tested in the 2019 census test. There's a report on the results that was published. And so the 2021 census included for the first time the gender question and the at birth precision to the sex question. And in April 2022, Canada became the first country to publish census data on the transgender and non-binary people. So the question on the left of the presentation is the previously asked question. So what is this person's sex? So the other two questions in the middle and the right of the screen, so it's were included in the 2021 census. So the sex at birth question, what was this person's sex at birth? And gender question is what is this person's gender? So they were included in the census short form. They were mandatory, asked regardless of age, and could be answered by proxy. And the gender question included three options, so male, female, or please specify. Just so you know, we don't say other, it's or please specify. So it's a write-in option. And the reason to have a write-in option, there are several reasons actually. The main one is to give the space for people to fully describe their gender instead of providing another option like non-binary person or a long list of options. Another reason is also to increase data quality by reducing the risk of false positives. So having the two questions, it's called the two-step approach, and it was recommended based on the consultations we did. So it allows us to have a gender inclusive question, measure the transgender population, and address important data gaps on the transgender and non-binary populations. So there's several factors that we need to consider when we collect data on sex at birth and gender. First, both concepts are not necessary for every statistical program. Social programs started collecting gender in 2018. And since then, we've been collecting gender by default, sometimes in combination with the sex at birth question, especially when there's a specific need to measure or get information on a transgender population or to derive health or demographic indicators. And the same logic applies to destination. Gender should be used by default. And this recommendation follows the Government of Canada's policy direction to modernize how the different departments and federal agencies handle information on sex and gender. So it's not only Statistics Canada who's using gender by default, it's the whole Canadian government. So historical comparability with previous years is not in itself a valid reason to be asking sex at birth. In fact, we don't know exactly how respondents who are transgender or non-binary used to answer the previously asked question on sex. It's likely they provided the gender they most closely identify with instead of their sex at birth. So when data on sex at birth, gender, and sexual orientation are available in the same survey, it's possible to measure the 2S LGBTQ plus population. So this is the new acronym we use at StatCan to describe people who are two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or use another term related to gender or sexual diversity. The two-spirit is a term used by some Indigenous people in North America. And so since the size of the transgender and non-binary populations are very small, there can be some issues related to data quality and confidentiality. And we'll go back to this topic. So there are, excuse me, these are the classifications used to disseminate information on sex at birth, gender, and gender diversity. So we have the classification of sex at birth with the two categories, male and female. Then we have the classification of gender with three categories, man, woman, and non-binary person. And as you may notice, the terminology is a bit different from the question, and I'll go back to this. And we also have the classification of cisgender, transgender, and non-binary that we also call gender diversity status of person. And it's derived by combining the other two classifications. So we have another classification of sex at birth called variant, which includes a third category for intersex, but we don't currently collect specific information on intersex people for reasons related to challenges in measuring that population. But I'll go back to this towards the end of my presentation. Prior to the 2021 census, we started working on updating the gender standard. So it was only published in 2018, but already we felt like we needed to make some changes to keep it relevant because the field of gender diversity is very quickly evolving, and same with the terminology that's used. So we did several consultations, including like meeting with experts. We also launched a public consultation in 2021 on the updated gender standard, and at the same time, we consulted on the new sexual orientation and LGBTQ2+ status standards. That was the acronym we used at the time. The updated gender standard was published in the fall of 2021. We published a What We Heard report that summarizes the comments we received during the consultation last August, and I added the link here. So very briefly, we received a lot of comments during the consultation on the terminology used related to gender. So we decided to replace male and female with men and women. We also decided to replace gender diverse with non-binary person. The main reason being that in French, the French translation was diverses identités de genre, and it didn't work really well. And non-binary person is now more commonly used by the population in the literature. So that was the other reason for that. So here's an image of our gender dissemination strategy. So how census data about gender is disseminated. So our goal here is to maintain the balance between preserving data confidentiality and disseminating as much as gender-based data as possible. So depending on the population thresholds, and those were determined by a team of methodologists, it's sometimes possible to publish information using the 3-category gender variable, or the 5-category gender diversity variable, as we did for our census release on gender diversity. But for confidentiality reasons, so we derived a 2-category gender variable with the labels men plus and women plus. So Claude will elaborate on how this category was created and the reason for that. This variable was used by default in most census data and analytical products, and a similar strategy is used in other social surveys. Historical comparisons can be done using the sex variable prior to 2021 and that of sex at birth or the two-category gender variable in 2021, but the change in name, concept, and definition should be clearly indicated. So it's using the two variables, so sex and the two-category gender variable together in data tables and analyses. So should not result in a big impact given the small size of these populations. If you're interested to know more about the change in concepts over time and also footnotes that we use in our publications when we use the two-category gender variable and the labels men plus and women plus, you can look at the age, sex at birth, and gender reference guide from the 2021 census. So I included the link so at the end, towards the end of the presentation. So I'll now present a few results from the 2021 census on gender diversity. So in May 2021, there were around 100,000 transgender or non-binary people in Canada, age 15 and older, living in a private household, representing about 1 in 300 people age 15 and older. Younger generations had larger shares of those who are transgender or non-binary. The proportion of transgender and non-binary people was 3 to 7 times higher for Gen Z and millennials than for Gen X, baby boomers, and the older generations, the interwar and greatest generations. So for our generations, we use definitions that are similar to the ones developed by the Pew Research Center. So non-binary and transgender people were younger on average than cisgender people. So in May 2021, the Canadian population aged 15 and older living in private households had an average age of 48 years, and in comparison, the average age of the transgender population was 40 years, and while that of the non-binary population was about 30 years. So close to 2/3 of transgender or non-binary people were under the age of 35. And gender diversity was highest among those aged 20 to 24, so almost close to 1 in 100 of whom were transgender or non-binary. And if you recall what I said a couple of slides ago, so for the general population aged 15 and older, it was 1 in 300 people. Here's a word cloud showing different terms used by people to specify their gender. So who wrote an answer. And the goal here is to show that there's a lot of diversity within gender diversity and the umbrella category of non-binary. Almost 1/3 of non-binary people aged 15 and older who provided valid answers to the write-in option used other terms than non-binary, including fluid, gender fluid, agender, queer, gender neutral, two-spirit, neither man nor woman, and gender non-conforming. So in the main census article on transgender and non-binary people, we also looked at the geographic distribution. I didn't include it here, but so towards the end of the presentation, there's a link to the daily article. So over the next few years, we're planning to continue our analysis of gender diversity in Canada. For instance, we're planning to look at socioeconomic well-being of transgender and non-binary people. And so we'll focus on socioeconomic gaps and inequalities by gender diversity status. And that has been identified by experts as an important data gap. We're also planning to look at transgender and non-binary youth. And for that, we'll do a bit more consultation. This was also identified as a big data gap. So I'll now present a brief overview of the new concept of gender diversity of couples and the results on couples that were included in the census family release. So here's a list of key conceptual changes for couple and family data in the census over the last 40 years. Prior to 2021, we used to define couple families based on sex of spouses or partners. The two categories were opposite and same-sex couples. And with the introduction of gender, we started defining couples using the gender diversity status of the person. This is a figure summarizing the new concept. So the family release included an analysis of cisgender, different gender, and same gender couples, as well as couples that are comprised of at least one transgender person or at least one non-binary person. Results from the 2021 census show that 98.5% of Canadian couples were different gender couples, meaning they included one woman and one man, both of whom were cisgender. An additional 1.5% of couples were either same gender, transgender, or non-binary couples. The majority of these couples were same gender couples, composed of either two cisgender women or two cisgender men, representing 1.1% of all couples. Transgender or non-binary couples, so where at least one member is transgender or non-binary, represented about 1 in every 250 couples. And within this group, transgender couples outnumber non-binary couples by about 2 to 1. We started working on the 2026 census. I'll show you some changes we're suggesting making to the census questionnaire related to gender, sex at birth, and sexual orientation. These changes were tested during the 2023 census qualitative testing, so we just finished testing, and will most likely be included in the 2024 census test, a quantitative test. But the content for that, the 2024 census test hasn't been decided yet. So we're first proposing modifying the order of the questions. So starting with date of birth, gender, and then sex at birth. It used to be the other way around. We're proposing updating the gender terminology, replacing male and female with men and women, to be consistent with the gender standard, and also because we received a lot of comments on the terminology. So to stay relevant, these options, we're suggesting to make them age dependent in the electronic questionnaire. So for children age 14 or younger, so the response options would be boy or girl, and or please specify. Asking gender first, so before the sex at birth question, would be consistent with our approach of collecting and using gender by default. We're also proposing, so adding more information in the help text and updating the definition, so just underneath the question, to make a clear distinction between the two concepts. So it tested really well doing qualitative testing already. Like from 5 years ago, we see that people understand these concepts a lot more. So yeah, we're positive about going forward. We've been working on making survey questionnaires, including the census, more gender inclusive. So for the census, for instance, with the question, the relationship to person one, So this question is generally, so person one is generally an adult who answers on behalf of other household members. And this question is used to create families and households. And in the electronic questionnaire, we want to make the response options generated so based on gender, the reported gender. And if a write-in answer is provided, then we're proposing to provide gender neutral or gender inclusive terms, such as the one you can see in green on the screen. We've been collecting data on sexual orientation since 2003, but not yet in the census. The question was tested during qualitative testing, but again, we don't know if it'll be included in the 2024 census test. The question is only asked of people aged 15 and older, as it is currently done in other social surveys. It would be included in the census long form, would be mandatory, and could be answered by proxy. So during consultations for the 2021 census, many data users indicated that this was a big data gap. And so there's a need for data on sexual orientation and the whole 2S LGBTQ+ population. So a new sexual orientation standard was published last August following many years of research and consultation. So very quickly, we're exploring the idea of developing a measure of the intersex population. During census collection, the public consultation, we were told repeatedly that we ought to account for this population. And we've been asked, why don't you just add a third option to the sex at birth question? Colleagues from New Zealand and Australia have done a lot of work on this topic. They've worked together on the question. As you can see on the screen, the questions are very similar. We've met with them. They mentioned that the inclusion of the intersex as an output to the sex question is not recommended. A separate question on variations of sex characteristics is more appropriate. New Zealand decided to include the question in their 2023 census, while Australia has included it or will include it in some of their house surveys. So we don't know yet what's more appropriate for Canada, and we're starting a feasibility study on the topic. We're also exploring the idea of developing a question on two-spirit identity. Also from consultation feedback, the qualitative testing and meetings with researchers, so it all points to the need of having a separate standalone question on the 2S, I'll say two-spirit identity, which would be so a dedicated question only asked people who are First Nations, Métis or Inuit. So this way it's clear that it's the two-spirit identity is only for those who are Indigenous. So in the 2022, the government of Canada adopted a new acronym, the 2S LGBTQI+, to be more inclusive and also place the experiences of Indigenous people at the forefront of as the first 2S LGBTQI+ peoples in North America. So we've met already with members of the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, and so we're starting to explore that idea to Statistique Canada. So I'll end my presentation with just showing you. So I included a lot of links here. So there are links to analytical reference data products that were released in 2022 on gender diversity, including the main article at the top of the screen. I've also including links because other articles, census articles, had small section on transgender and non-binary population. So here's a list of other articles, products that were released. And finally, publications on sexual and gender diversity. So I'm just finishing with, these are links to the Government of Canada. So recently published, so inclusive writing tools. There's also a tool called Inclusionary. It includes, so it provides a lot of examples for gender neutral or gender inclusive solutions, and in both English and French, very useful. So I will turn to Claude for the part 2 of our presentation.
Merci, France-Pascale. Hi, everyone. As it was mentioned initially, I'm a senior methodologist at Statistics Canada. Senior methodologist is our jargon for survey statistician, if you prefer. And in this very short presentation, I think I only have 3 slides. I'm going to discuss some of the methodological considerations that went into the dissemination strategy that was used for the census and is being recommended for the other surveys. So that's going to give you some insights into how the data looks to you from the outside based on what went into their creation or their dissemination. Next. Wrong direction.
Ouais, excuse-moi, je juste un peu. Okay. Ouais. Okay.
So at the heart of our recommendations is for survey areas and the census to create a new two-category gender variable, as France-Pascale mentioned, whose categories are to be labeled men plus and women plus. We introduced this two-category gender variable to facilitate dissemination based on confidentiality concerns. So while we expect, and actually it was a case for the census, that the census would be able to disseminate detailed information on gender at the highest level in Canada, actually drilling into the data, then we expect the switch to be made to the two-category gender variable, which is the only one really viable to disseminate information as to respect confidentiality of respondents. From a user perspective, this is not something you'll have to derive on your own. This will be created by the survey areas when they are putting together their dissemination products. So specifically internally, it's the project methodology support team that creates it. And how do they do it? They do it by randomly coding to men plus and women plus the non-binary individual that are actually found to be part of the three-category gender variable initially. The key part here is the randomly as opposed to deterministic. So what is deterministic? It's just a fancy name to say that when you have a process that's deterministic, is that you always get the same outcome from the same input. So whenever you have such a process, day in and day out, you provide the same data at the entry, you'll get the same answer at the output. We don't want that. We want a random process. So whenever you actually apply it to the same input, you may get different outcomes for the same input. I'm not going to go into the details, but I left in the annex a numerical example, which is completely fictional, but that's going to give you an idea of how survey areas were instructed to get that variable. Next. So how is it created in-house? it's a new process. So in essence, we could have new methods and new systems. But obviously, it's kind of useless to reinvent the wheel when we already have methods and systems that are well designed to do this, even though they've been used in other contexts, namely non-response. So here, we advise survey areas to use what is called imputation. Instead of using on non-response, they use it on perfectly valid gender collected data in order to obtain the new gender variable. There's been one big exception though. We've been advising survey areas that they are not to pursue accuracy at all costs like they would try to do when addressing non-response. Indeed, in this case, we want to have subject matter areas refrain from using variables that could be, from a statistical point of view, highly correlated with gender. And we have in mind specifically sex at birth. So whatever statistical model subject areas want to use, it must not use highly correlated variable, namely sex, gender, or any other variable. One of the big reasons for this is that, for one, we want to protect confidentiality, and therefore we're not going after accuracy at all costs. And also, it appears way more respectful of non-binary individual not to try and liken their status to such variables like sex at birth. As is usually the rule with confidentiality measures, we are to say as little as possible as to what went into it. So we may say something like random allocation, random recoding of non-binary individuals to men plus and women plus, but not disclose exactly what variables and what were the categories used to drive that random recoding. You'll obviously notice some kind of discrepancy between the input to the statistical process, namely collected data, and the output, which is the disseminated statistical information. We notice that we collect gender and store it in a 3-category variable, only to release it, for the most part, in 2 categories. How we reconcile the two is that even though, for the time being, we're not able to disseminate information at a finer level, it still allows respondents to better describe their gender at the entry point of the statistical process. Furthermore, and we know that from experience, this is not expected to be a static process. As with other issues of interest to society, practices do evolve over time as further experience is gained and social norms change. If I may, an analogy is that typically when we want to address confidentiality, we kind of approach a situation as if we were near a cliff. We always want to be on the safe side, on the ground, going nearer to the edge, and try to maybe further down the road, when we have more experience, be able to get closer to what we can safely disseminate, as opposed to go and rush and be basically over the edge, for which there's basically no coming back. Next. So some of the questions that arise from a user perspective and how they're basically addressed internally. One of the example of the question we've had so far is, can we have the 3-category gender sit in an analytical file next to the new one, which has 2 categories? So can they be there side by side? At the end of the day, it depends on the use that's made of a framework called the 5 Safe that comes to us, to National Statistical Offices from the UK. It was developed in the UK. And it's something I find very handy to try to get your mind around. How do you get to protect confidential information? So without going into the details per se, the framework acknowledges that there are 5 levers by which National Statistical Organization can act on confidential data. So you have safe projects, safe people, safe data, safe output, and safe settings. Whatever combination you do of those levers, the goal is the same. You want to have in the big thermometer the height of the mercury that reached the safe level. But you can, as you see, based on different access solution, get different combination that will do the trick. So that may explain why if you gain access to StatCan and statistical information, depending on the route you take, the data access solution you can take, you may see different requirements. And this is basically in the background the 5 Cs that are playing out. So if you were to access something like a public use microdata file called a PUMF, then all the emphasis is on the safe data dimension. In essence, the PUMF has to fend for itself on its own. Whereas if you were to deal with a share file, then the share file is only distributed to trusted partners, and therefore we can alleviate the confidentiality protection that's put in the data, knowing that we have trusted users that will implement the rules that we have in mind. As France-Pascale mentioned, just a big reminder, especially in French, promote the use of gender-neutral terminology. In French, it's very important because many words exist in both forms, in masculine and feminine, and therefore trying to avoid all this by using gender-neutral. So there are some examples on the slide, but France-Pascale has way more in the links that she provided. And finally, for everyone at StatCan, we have provided a non-technical report that details the recommendation that I've briefly discussed today with you. And that concludes our presentation.